Welcome back to Parker's Theorem by Windatyourback. My sister was looking for something on my desk the other day. She was like, "Where is it?" I was like, "It's underneath the stack of Spiderman heads on sticks." And she was like, "What?" And I was like, "It's underneath the stack of Spiderman heads on sticks." And it was underneath the stack of Spider-Man heads on sticks. This has been way too much fun to use these, so I'm gonna keep doing it. You can't stop me. Anyway, Parker's Theorem by Windatyourback, Chapter 3, The Belief That It Is. We'll get to Toby eventually, but for now, that's all you can see. And yes, the drawing will update to have Toby eventually. Drink some pretentious soda. Alright. Chapter 3, The Belief That It Is. He's dreaming. Or maybe he isn't. Peter Parker was awake and asleep, all at the same time, which was a peculiar notion, since they were direct antonyms. He was conscious and fully aware, but his breathing was out of his control. It was as though some external source was pumping his lungs for him. They were slow, steady, following a consistent rhythm of one in deep slumber. Blinking and shaking his head a little, he turned and took in his environment. It was hued with a mix of red and orange, a stretching fog or sort of mist enveloping around the horizon. He almost thought that might be standing in some kind of reddish cloud, aside from the fact that his feet were definitely touching solid ground. It almost unnerved him how flat the ground was, without a single bump or groove or any kind of flaw. Glancing down, he saw that the soles of his feet were pressing against water. It was still, flat, thin as a sheet of paper, and it spread as far as he could see, like some never-ending thin puddle or something. It reminded him of the salt flats in the Himalayas that he'd seen online a lot. What a strange environment. A familiar environment. Had he seen it in a dream before? No, not a dream. Somewhere else. "Hello?" he called out. His voice echoed out everywhere around him, as though 1,000 other Peters called back to him. As he slowly turned on the spot to take in this strange world, he realized that there wasn't an ounce of fear or dread inside of him. He was strangely calm. Somber. Sad almost. But calm. Forget who this is. Cross-species genetics, a voice called out to him. Peter spun around and almost gasped in shock at the appearance of a group of teenagers, maybe around the same age as him, each of them in semi-formal clothes and wearing an ID badge pinned to their fronts, standing clumped in a group and facing in Peter's general direction. Stumped by their appearance, and by the most peculiar choice of words to call out to somebody, he watched slack-jawed as the crowd turned and parted slightly to reveal the person who had spoken. Peter really did gasp this time. A young man with fluffy brown hair and black-rimmed glasses tried to blend behind the backs of the crowd, but the gap was too large to attempt to hide behind, so he nervously leaned into view. Unlike the rest of the group gathered around, the boy was not in formal attire. He had a dark green jacket and a scratched-up-looking backpack, the sleeves of his hoodie under his coat pulled up over the back of his hands, and was nervously clutching a battered skateboard next to his leg. It was, undoubtedly, Peter 3, a much younger, much more anxious Peter 3, who clearly did not seem to be enjoying the spotlight. "Pete?" Peter breathed, stepping forward, but Peter 3 was already speaking again. "Person gets Parkinson's when the brain cells that produce dopamine start to appear," Peter 3 was saying. He wasn't looking at Peter directly, but instead just to the right of him, as if he was speaking to somebody who wasn't there. "But a zebrafish has the ability to regenerate cells on command. If you can somehow give this ability to the woman you're talking about, that's that. She's curing herself." "Yeah, you just have to look past the gills on her neck," someone in the crowd added, and their peers hummed a low chuckle in response. Peter 3 didn't even crack a smile, leaning from left to right on his feet nervously. His eyes had glanced over, still missing Peter, but now gazing slightly to the left. Peter turned and almost jumped out of his skin at the sight of another person who had seemingly appeared out of nowhere. It was a beautiful young girl, once again around his own age. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a ponytail, and she was wearing a white lab coat, evidently some kind of junior staff member. There was a slight twinkle in her eye, playful, yet endearing, and was smiling slightly at Peter 3. Peter knew her name. He didn't know how, but he knew her name as though he always had known it. Her name was Gwen Stacy. As soon as the name conjured in his mind, the environment suddenly shifted and transformed. The fog around him grew dense, and the reddish hue lost its color, turning into shades of gray and black. Gwen Stacy faded into nothing, and he turned around just in time to watch the teenagers and Peter 3 disappear into plumes of dark smoke and disappear. I messed up, sorry. Peter 3 vanish into plumes of dark smoke and disappear. Panic hit Peter like a freight train, as if the world he had been standing in was merely holding those emotions at bay. His control of his breathing came back to him, almost slamming him in the chest, and he gasped as though he'd just been wrenched from under the water for a long time. Panting at the thinning air, he spun around in the spot whilst fruitlessly trying to subdue his fresh terror. "Peter!" he yelled out into the infinity. "Peter!" He spun around once again and lost his footing, but he did not fall. Instead, he floated, suspended in midair. Gravity seemed to have been wrenched out from him, and he floated in the dark, endless abyss that pressed around him. Something twinkled in the corner of his eye, and he pivoted around once again. For a moment, he thought it was a star winking at him in the black expanse surrounding him, but he blinked and properly focused at the white point. It wasn't a star. It was a spider's web. And as soon as he saw it, more appeared around him. Tens, hundreds, thousands of spider webs, each knotted and strung around each other, tiny little points glistening among them like a galaxy of stars. They were interconnected, each winding their way through the thinnest of white strands to connect, imitating a collection of constellations weaving around each other. They spun around him, not dizzyingly so, but enough to almost make him feel nauseous. The colors glowed around him, a pale pink, then into cobalt blue, then shamrock green, then a scarlet red. "What am I looking at?" he asked the void, naturally accepting an inner understanding that the void would be able to reply back. "Everything," the voice responded. "It is the moments ago and years ago, and the beginning and the middle and everything in between. It was here, and it made a tear, and now you are here." I don't understand." "It is coming, something blind and terrible. You are swimming further and further out to sea, and beyond are things blind and terrible. You are coming to it." I don't understand." "Do not look at it." Peter got the feeling that something was watching him. I said that weird. Peter got the feeling that something was watching him. Despite the warning from whatever had called out at him, he turned around. Fear struck Peter Parker dead on the spot. Surely he was dead, because whatever he was looking at could not be so dark, so terrible, that it could stare him in the eyes like that. It was staring at him, in him. It could not exist. How could something like that be here? How could it be holding on to him? "Peter!" Peter sat up in bed and immediately took notice of the chills sweeping down his body from the cold sweat that had overcome him. Hands trembling slightly, Peter groaned and placed a hand on his sweaty forehead, kneading it and closing his eyes. Slowly, his senses attuned to his environment. There was a sizzling noise of hot food being fried, and a warm scent of fried eggs wafting in the air. Peter opened his eyes again and took in the mess of his studio apartment. Everything was as it was. Clothes strewn on the floor, textbooks and pencils overflowing his desk, fresh daylight pouring in from the frayed, translucent curtains haphazardly drawn over the 2 windows. The only real difference, much to Peter's rising elation, was his temporary roommate standing at the tiny kitchen in the corner. Peter 3 was up, still dressed in the oversized Star Wars shirt and a noticeable lack of pants on, just like last night. He was standing in front of the stove, poking at some eggs in the pan with a spatula, and attempting to butter some slightly hardened and dry bread with his other hand. After a brief moment, he glanced round, catching Peter's eyes, and smiled merrily with an innocently mischievous beam. "Morning, sleepyhead," he called out loudly, and Peter groaned again, much louder, as his head throbbed in pain. Can you whisper, please?" Peter mumbled. "Not really!" Peter yelled back with a shit-eating grin. Peter groaned once more and collapsed into bed, wincing at the headache attacking his skull. "You're such a lightweight, you couldn't even make it until closing time." "Maybe I should call the cops and tell them Spiderman supplied an underage teenager with alcohol," Peter replied grumpily. He couldn't shake off the strange feeling that nestled in his stomach, an underlying sense of dread and an anxiety that gnawed in his gut. "You didn't have to shout my name out so loud, though." "Huh?" Peter 3 questioned, flipping the eggs over onto one of the partially buttered slices of bread. "Unless you're responding to Sleepyhead now, I didn't shout your name. Is the hangover that bad, then?" Peter didn't respond. Now that he thought about it, that voice he heard wasn't much like Peter 3's at all. It was much younger. He didn't recognize it at all. Peter felt a gentle weight press onto his legs, and he glanced up. Peter 3 was placing down one of Peter's chipped second-hand plates, and resting atop was a slightly warm sandwich with 2 fried eggs squeezed in between the bread. "Aunt May cooks me these every New Year's Day," Peter 3 said, sitting cross-legged on the other end of Peter's bed with his own plate, and shaking a half-empty bottle of ketchup. "Eggs help with hangover, you know. Good source of protein and stuff." Peter 3 squirted a generous amount of ketchup onto his eggs, folded the bread over, and grinned playfully up at his younger brother. "I haven't seen a hangover as bad as yours since my first senior party. I almost didn't even make it home that night. But then I always think it's a worthwhile life experience to wake up shit-faced in the gutter in the South Bronx." "Thanks." Peter sat up properly and started to tuck into his hearty breakfast, cautiously wondering if the eggs were still in date or not. "But it's not all the hangover, I think. I had a really weird dream. I can hardly remember it, though." "Was it just a weird dream, or like..." Peter 3 paused and absently waved his hand in the air. "You know..." Whoops, wrong Peter. You know, interdimensional influence dream stuff. 'Cause I read this book once, and it's the latter. I need to use both hands. Hold up. Peter replied, pushing the subject forward before Peter 3 could break into rambling. I think I spoke to a void? That's dope as fuck. It spoke back. That's metal as fuck. Peter paused, his forehead creasing as he fought to recollect the dream. Then he jerked and said, before he could stop himself, "You were there too! I was in the void? No, it was before that. Or after. I can't remember. You were younger. You had glasses on, and you were talking about, fish? Zebrafish?" Peter 3 almost spat out his sandwich, wiping ketchup from the corner of his mouth. He gawked at Peter in astonishment. "What? But how? How did you dream that? That was..." "What?" Peter questioned confusedly. "Did that actually happen?" "Yeah!" Peter 3 exclaimed, raising his hands above his head and pressing the bottom of his palms against his temples. "It was years ago! I snuck into Oscorp Tower and got caught up in some internship tour thing. And then Dr. Connors was there before he turned himself into a stupid green gecko, and I answered a question about his reptile research and being able to self-cure yourself with epimorphic regeneration. And And Peter 3 stopped, staring at the younger Peter with a mix of pure shock and a bit of reverence. Man, you get to fight aliens in space and get dreams of the past. And all I get was some angry Russian stereotype in a rhinoceros machine. It's kind of whack. I don't know if I want to talk about it, Peter mumbled, bowing his head slightly until his overgrown fringe flopped a little in front of his eyes. I keep getting nervous whenever I think about that dream. Like, completely irrationally nervous. Peter 3 blew air from his cheeks, apparently at a loss of what to say, then decided to just push the plate with the partially eaten egg sandwich closer to Peter. Eat, dude. I put love and care into those eggs, you know. It's an old Parker recipe. Peter took his sandwich and slowly ate, trying to tear his thoughts away from the strange shapes from his dreams that kept swirling in his mind. He snapped back into concentration what felt like minutes later when he saw movement in the corners of his vision and watched as Peter 3 squeezed back into his tight Spiderman suit. Are you going? Peter asked, dropping the crust of his sandwich onto his plate and scrambling out of bed in a flurry of movement, his heart beginning to race with an eerily familiar sense of dread. Going where exactly? Peter 3 replied with a soothing smile. Can't exactly just get a train home right now. Don't worry, I got up early to start working on something. Need your help, though. Peter 3 gestured toward the sofa, and Peter approached. There was a battered map of Manhattan lying on one end of the sofa, apparently whisked from a tourist information center, judging by the label in the corner. It didn't seem to be altered in any way, except for a single black circle outlined on the map with a scribble next to it. As Peter leaned in closer, he quickly identified it being pinpointed at his own apartment, with a date and time written in tiny letters beside it. It's where and when I appeared in your universe, I think, Peter 3 explained. The time might be wrong by half an hour, give or so, or give or take, but we got the place and date. So if you mark down where you felt those tingly pain episodes, and the date and time, if you remember it, and then we could head out to each of those spots, and hypothesize, and come to some kind of conclusion, hopefully. Fuck around and find out, Peter corrected with a little grin. Peter 3 spat out a bark of laughter and playfully whacked Peter around the head. Mark the spots and get your suit on, smartass, Peter 3 said, still grinning. I don't want to take the subway, I'd rather swing. Jonah Jameson's gonna have an aneurysm when he finds out there's 2 Spidermen swinging around New York, Peter stated, picking up a pen from the floor and starting to mark the various locations across Manhattan that he could recall having those brief episodes of pain and potential dimension swinging. Oh, that'll be funny! We'll have to tune in when the news breaks, Peter 3 replied with a snicker, picking up a green coat from the floor and putting it on over his costume. Seeing Peter's fleeting expression of worry, he added, Hey, look, don't let what he says bother you. Jameson is a bit of a joke. He lives off trying to drag you down, but none of their opinions matter. We just do what we do, even if they don't appreciate it, right? Right, Peter nodded. Peter 2's words echoed in his mind. It's what we do. Oh wait, I get to use Toby. Peter 2's words echoed in his mind. It's what we do. God, I can't do different voices for any of them. I'm so bad at doing, normal voices. I can do caricature voices pretty easily, you can do caricature voices, and, very easy, stylized voices I can do a lot, but I can't differentiate between 3 fairly normal-sounding adult males, Which is weird, because people say that I sound like a guy, so... I also keep kicking my goddamn cord to this monitor. Hold on. Technical difficulties. I unplugged my monitor by accident. Hold on. Did I unplug the... Ha! Ha! I found it. Okay. And we're back. All right. Let's get going. The news circulated around like a wildfire in Manhattan. The sight of Spider-Man swinging around the city was always a treat, especially for tourists. But today, New York was awed by the hushed rumors that there was not one, but two Spider-Men spotted swinging around New York together, both of them dressed in blue and red, one with a green winter coat, and the other with a somewhat battered backpack. Footage recorded on phones quickly circulated around the internet of the pair taking on a robbery at a jewelry shop expertly and without hardly a scratch of property damage. They worked in tandem, swinging and maneuvering around each other, jumping in with sneak attacks whilst the other acted as a distraction, and vanishing into the noise of the city before the police even showed up, leaving nothing behind but stray webs and several tied-up criminals. "It's an outrage! A scandal!" The voice of doing a good job. Channel my inner Cave Johnson. I feel bad because I can never remember the actual actor's name. I can only remember him as Cave Johnson. "Do you know who I am? I'm the man who's gonna burn your house down with the lemons." Make life rue the day he gave Cave Johnson lemons. The voice of J. Jonah Jameson roared from a large screen in Times Square. His face was reddened with ferocity, shaking his fists and looking as though he was about to stand up and throw his chair every few moments. "We already have to deal with one masked vigilante menace swinging around New York, causing property damage and answering to no one, and now there's two of them. Two lawless corrupt criminals running around our city and acting like they own it. Jared, get me my coffee. It's gonna be a long day." It's not even a very good impression. I'm trying my best. Opposite the screen in Times Square, sat upon the edge of one of the large buildings surrounding the area, two Spider-Men were each munching away on a Subway sandwich, pointing and laughing at Jameson's increasingly aggressive rants, before eventually hopping off and swinging away into the streets. Blazing across New York with a second Spider-Man felt almost surreal. Peter was keeping up well enough with his counterpart, but he had to admit that the flair and experience Peter 3 possessed sometimes left the younger Peter lagging behind. Yet it was an incredible experience. So long had he spent his days both as Peter Parker and Spider-Man, lost and alone, suffering with a wretched loneliness incomparable to anything he had fathomed beforehand. And now, by some sheer miracle and stroke of luck, he was blessed, however temporary, with the reappearance of someone who could provide company to both of these personas, and understand on a level that nobody else ever could. Even if their shared patrol of the city was going well, their main mission of figuring out why the multiverse might be breaking again was less than successful. Each spot they turned up at that was marked on their map incurred no results. No pains, no vanishing, no transferal between alternate universes. It frustrated the both of them to a point where Peter 3 literally threw the younger Peter at the precise spot he saw the former Avengers Tower vanish. But it created no result other than Peter getting stuck within the tight branches of a tree for nearly 10 minutes. Wow, you threw him really hard. Still, even despite the lack of conclusive evidence and the disappearance of any leads they had, Peter secretly was harboring no complaints on the matter. In fact, the delay in their investigation left him almost overjoyed. Being able to hang out with somebody, even better being a version of himself from another universe, was easily one of the best things that had happened to him in months. Whether it was because they were literal universe counterparts, or because they had so much to bond over, Peter really did recognize Peter 3 as an older brother. The connection segmented between them was strong. It was almost as if they had known each other throughout their whole lives. Peter often said in the past that he would have disliked meeting another version of himself, since he'd only be able to witness his flaws. But maybe it was the differences between them, or the different face, that made him love Peter 3 so dearly. We all love Peter 3. We love you, Andrew. Yet there was still a mounting frustration when they finished going through all the spots marked on their map that the pair shared between them. As quickly as this mystery had developed, they no longer had any leads. They concluded their search by lying on the rooftop on a building in Queens, reclined in opposite directions, but their heads directly next to each other. "What now?" Peter 3 asked tiredly, absent-mindedly fiddling with the strings of his coat. "I don't know," Peter... "Dunno," Peter replied with a half-hearted shrug. "I guess we'll have to talk to Dr. Strange." "Okay, and why didn't we do that in the first place? He doesn't know me anymore, remember? Plus, I don't really want to deal with his wrath when he finds out I've somehow broken the multiverse a second time. We can figure this out on our own." Their conversation was broken apart by the sounds of scuffling and loud voices. Scrambling to their feet, they quickly moved toward the edge of the rooftop to look over the alleyway where the source of noise was coming from. There was no danger, only a small group of schoolboys who had clearly just got off from school, but both Peters recognized the trouble instantly. They had, after all, been subject to it in their own school days. An entourage of 3 taller kids had cornered a much smaller boy, pushed against the brick wall, and repeatedly smacking him around the head. The smaller boy looked humiliated and miserable, mumbling words of lackluster protests while the aggressor continued to push him around. One of the other boys seized the small boy's abandoned backpack on the ground, rummaging around it with an expression of greed etched into his face. Peter 3 was already moving into action. He hopped down from the roof, landing neatly on 2 feet, and cleared his throat dramatically. The 3 boys swung round, their contorted faces twisting with annoyance, suddenly turning into fear. Like deers caught in headlights, they started to back away.
"Tragedy! What else can I call it? What more needs to be said? The damage, the destruction, you saw it with your own eyes."
Jonah Jameson's voice of the past whispered in Peter's mind, freezing him to the spot, only able to watch the scene below play out. The other Spider-Man folded his arms, imitating a cross mother, and the 3 boys nudged each other in a panic and proceeded to flee. Spider-Man made no effort to chase after them, silently watching them run before turning and moving towards the young boy. "This your bag?" Spider-Man said, picking it up from the ground. He spun it around in his hands and then dramatically gasped. "Oh wow, that a Spider-Man logo? You got a Spider-Man backpack?" The young boy, whose expression had been anxious and solemn, broke into a small, watery smile and nodded.
"When will the people wake up and realize that everywhere Spider-Man goes, chaos and calamity ensue? Everything Spider-Man touches comes to ruin."
Jameson's voice continued to play out in his head, the conclusive words he had heard months ago after witnessing his aunt's death. At the time, those words had rebounded and sung in his head for weeks and weeks afterwards. But, for the first time ever, he was witnessing a lie to those statements, and seeing the truth of what Spider-Man really was.
"No way! Spider-Man is my favorite hero!"
"No! Frick! This wasn't the kid, this is Andrew, sorry. No way! Spider-Man is my favorite hero!" Spider-Man replied to the boy's agreement.
"You can't do that! You're Spider-Man!"
The little boy responded quietly, his small grin and spark of excitement growing with each passing moment. "I can be my own favorite hero! It's allowed!" Spider-Man replied, and handed the bag back to the young boy. "What's your name?"
"Max?"
"Those other kids bothering you, Max?" Max's bottom lip trembled. After a moment, he nodded. "Don't let them get to you. You just gotta work up the courage to not let them target you. Can I tell you a secret? When I got picked on at school, too, when I was a kid."
"You did?"
"Yeah, even heroes get picked on sometimes. But you just don't let them get to you. You show them how much cooler you really are. And you gotta be cool if you like Spider-Man, obviously."
"And we, the innocents, are left to pick up the pieces."
"I didn't know there were 2 Spider-Men,"
Max said, and Peter suddenly became self-conscious of the fact that Max was pointing up at him. Feeling awkward, Peter raised his hand in greeting and waved nervously in return. Peter 3 laughed and slowly started to escort Max out of the alleyway. Yeah, there's 2 Spider-Men for a little bit. Hey, what if I told you he was another Spider-Man from another universe?
There's no such thing.
Kay, what if I told you he was my little brother? Max nodded.
That makes more sense.
He's up there doing scouting, you see, Peter 3 explained as they walked. Peter followed from the rooftop. Just making sure that nothing gets us from up high.
Is something going to get us? Like those aliens that attacked the city years ago? I watched a film about it in school. They came in a big circle ship and they tried to fight Iron Man.
No, aliens ain't gonna come. Peter 3 grinned, although baffled that Max spoke as though an alien attack happened every other weekday in New York. Although, I don't trust pigeons. Never trust pigeons, Max. They'll get in your way on purpose when you're swinging. So this is what it meant, Peter thought, as they walked Max around the block to his home. To be a true, friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. He hadn't forgotten what it was like to assist the citizens of New York. No doubt, he had his stint long enough in Queens, doing that after the events of Germany. But even in his time now, he had neglected to think first of the people. Instead, he targeted criminals, always itching to fight, wanting to fall back onto rage, but only being left hopeless and melancholic. But this was what it meant to do good, to be the Spider-Man that protected and helped New York. Peter silently watched from the rooftops above as young Max arrived at his front doorstep, gave Peter 3 a big hug, waved happily towards Peter, who awkwardly returned it, and vanished into the threshold of his family home. He stood in silence on the rooftop for a moment, just staring at the door and thinking about Aunt May. Peter felt a gentle hand on his shoulder. Sniffling a little, he turned to see Peter 3 looking at him. Even from behind the mask, he could feel his elder brother observing and studying him carefully. Peter gave a small nod, as if to say, "I'm okay." "Let's go somewhere else," Peter 3 said, gesturing for Peter to follow. "It's not far. I really hope it's still there, but I think you might like it." The swing took about 10 minutes or so to get there. Their destination was over a chain-link fence and into an abandoned boathouse on the edge of Queens by the East River overlooking the Manhattan horizon. The old boat shop was large and spacious, with a mix of wooden and iron rafters holding the place together, as well as a couple rusted small boats and kayaks hanging from the ceiling from chains. Peter 3 pulled off his mask, bouncing around the area and gazing around with a huge beam of joy. "I can't believe this is here! It feels like coming home. This place got refurbished into a boating club back in my world," Peter 3 exclaimed, hopping around the chamber blissfully with a static, joyous grin plastered on his face. "Whoops. Sorry. Looks like we aren't the only ones who know about it, though," he added, pointing towards a corner of the room where there was an old, beaten radio and a battered skateboard missing a wheel left behind. "Did you used to skate here yourself?" Peter asked, pulling off his own mask and following Peter 3 in, taking in the environment with curiosity. Yeah, a lot, especially after I got bit. I actually trained here, too, practicing my climbing and stuff. I came up with the idea of web swinging by jumping from chains." Peter sat on one of the slightly elevated steps up to the ground level, fumbling around in his rucksack for his spare clothes. He deemed better to hide his Spider-Man costume in case they got caught, and he really didn't want to get his cover blown, and watched with keen interest as Peter 3 investigated the abandoned skateboard whilst rummaging through his bag and stuffing his mask in the bottom of the rucksack's interior. Peter 3 spun the wheels on the board with interest, tilting his head like a curious puppy, then glanced cautiously around and thwip! He spat out a thick line of webbing, clinging onto something lying in the shadows, and let it hurtle into his open palm. He turned his hand around and revealed it to be the missing wheel of the skateboard. Functional, and just simply not attached. With a little bit of extra thick webbing, it was affixed to the skateboard in an instant. "Dope!" Peter 3 nodded with a half-grin, impressed by his own ingenuity. He leaned over towards the radio, fiddling with the dials and moving through radio waves of static, passing over muffled music and snatches of conversation, until settling on a frequency playing some classic upbeat rock music. "Oh, I love Queen!" Peter called out with a grin, midway through pulling on a faded, long-sleeved Midtown Science sweater from his bag and over his Spider-Man costume. Peter 3 smacked the young Peter on the backside of the head for the second time again that day. "It's the Who, you little shit, and don't you ever get it wrong again!" With a playful smirk, he dodged a well-aimed kick from Peter and dropped the skateboard to the floor, rolling away with a shit-eating grin and a teasing middle finger. Holding nothing but the desire to spend as much time as they could together, the two spent the better part of the afternoon messing around in the boathouse. Peter 3 performed some tricks, much to Peter's joy, and Peter tried skating much to Peter 3's humor. Clearly, the talent for skateboarding wasn't hereditary between universes, because Peter had fallen off 3 times within the span of 5 minutes and almost dislocated his shoulder whilst trying to kickflip. Regardless, it was one of the best days Peter had experienced in what felt like an eternity. It was a little juxtaposing to think that 12 hours ago, he'd been on the edge of a rooftop contemplating ending his life, and was now screwing around New York City with his self from an alternate universe. The emotional whiplash was a little exhausting, but he genuinely felt happy. Really, truly happy. A kind of happiness he hadn't felt since portions of the Europe trip whilst hanging out with MJ. Their hangout time felt like it could have gone on for days. The pair messed around in the rafters, swinging around on the low-hanging chains and aiming high fives with each bounding leap. Peter 3 attempted to teach the younger boy an iconic dance from some old 80s John Hughes movie when a song from Simple Minds began to play from the radio. And Peter taught some excellent swear words that he had made up with Ned back in junior year. After Peter 1's near victory on an impromptu "who can climb on the ceiling and then backflip as many times to the ground without breaking their ankles" competition, the pair finally found themselves relaxing on oaken rafters above the boathouse, sitting back to back and sharing a can of Coke between them. That would make a good ad for Coke. Both of them were grinning, enjoying both the smattering of small talk as well as the occasional stretches of companionable quiet between them. "I meant to ask," Peter 3 said, handing the can over towards Peter. "If you don't mind me asking, that is, about MJ." Peter remained silent, sipping on the can cautiously and swinging his legs, but his elevated mood was starting to dwindle into melancholy again. "Why don't you talk to her again, man?" Peter 3 asked. "Like, I know you're not... She doesn't remember anything or whatever, but... Well, you know, you could always start again with her. You loved her." "Yeah," Peter replied quietly. "Yeah, I do love her still. But I saw what I did to her. She got put in danger because of me. She almost died so many times. When I saw her in that shop, her and Ned, well, she was fine. She was okay. But most of all, she was safe. I realized that there was no me to put her in danger, to put her future in danger. So I let her go. I let them both go." Peter shrugged casually, but his heart was feeling tender again. "I don't regret it. It hurts like hell, but I don't think I did the wrong thing." Peter 3 didn't reply. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the tinny music from the radio playing several feet beneath them. "What are you going to do after you get your GED?" Peter 3 asked eventually, swinging his legs back and forth. "You said about community college, but I know you can do better than that. You got the brains." "Empire State is a nice idea, but I don't know. It's hard finding me on the system. The spell complicated a lot of stuff. I'm on there, but like, people don't know it's me, and what's the real reason, though?" Peter jerked, as if he had been punched, and swallowed hard. The temptation to hesitate and stumble through lies again was alluring, but he quietly reminded himself that this was someone he could trust, someone who could understand. I don't know. I don't really look forward to my future. Like, I just kind of expect disappointment, so I'll never really be disappointed. I got so used to the notion of having no future that I stopped. I stopped bothering about having one. Peter 3 shifted slightly. That feeling resonated hard. Go to Empire State, Peter 3 said firmly, as though making the finality of the decision concrete. Go study whatever you want. You'd be great at bioengineering. All that stuff we did curing those people months ago, you were great. I know you can do it. You've got a future, Peter. It's not over. We'll rebuild together. Like I said, right? We'll rebuild. There's no we, a harsh voice in Peter's head whispered. You're going to leave as soon as we figure out what's going on. I'll be on my own again. Peter jerked his head as if to rid the thought from his mind. He didn't want to think about that right now. They sat in silence again, this one stretching much longer. But it wasn't awkward. It was comfortable, simply enjoying each other's company, attuned to their own thoughts, but relishing in the sheer idea of simply being together. The sun was dipping at this hour, although it was still an hour or so until true sunset. It cast yellow rays that peeked out from the windows of the boathouse, illuminating one wall of the room in a brilliant gold and casting shadows of themselves and the rafters they were sat upon against. Peter's thoughts had returned to his dream. Towards the end, he had seen something. Something that had filled him with gut-wrenching fear beyond anything he had felt before. A terror that froze his blood, so profound and shattering that he had really thought he died from the sheer shock of it. But he couldn't remember it, even despite all of those notions. Was it just because it had been a dream that slipped from his fingers? Or because his mind was consciously blocking it out so that fear wouldn't return? Something else was nagging him. He had seen someone else. A woman. Oh, but of course. He had seen... Peter? Who was Gwen? Peter asked cautiously, clenching his knuckles and hunching his shoulders as though he were in trouble. I know. You said she was your MJ. His heart stung. But was she... There was a stretching silence after Peter trailed off, and he wondered if he had overstepped. But then the reply came. Gruff, thick, but not shaky. Let me drink some soda for this part. She was my path, Peter 3 replied. Strangely enough, his voice seemed calm. Soft, sad, yet calm. She was funny and brave and clever, and she was everything. We were going to move to England together. She was going to study in Oxford, and I was going to support her. But He paused, grimacing and closing his eyes. Peter wondered if he was about to break down, but Peter 3 lifted his head again. He continued to speak calmly, but there were tears in the corners of his eyes. Wait, hold up. God damn it, I stopped recording so that I could put tears on Andrew, and then I started recording again, and something happened and it didn't record. Now I gotta read all this again. God damn it. Okay, don't look. Spoilers. Where were we? Where is something else? It wasn't your frog. It was scared. Peter 3 lifted his head again. He continued to speak calmly, but there were tears in the corners of his eyes. I lost her. She fell off a tower, and I tried to save her. But it was my fault. Peter wanted to interrupt and tell him, no, it wasn't your fault. You were trying to save her. You did what you had to. But he knew better than to say words like those to Peter Parker, whether that version was himself or someone else. They were deflective words. They would never really be true in their heart and minds. She was my path, Peter 3 repeated, and he bowed his head. Peter silently watched as his brother pressed the palms of his hands into his eyes, pushing to attempt to stem the tears, but they escaped from his hands, sliding down his cheeks. I'm sorry, Peter mumbled. That's why I didn't want you to end up like me, Peter 3 replied, sitting up again. He let the tears flow. There was a moment on the statue when your MJ fell. It could have happened again. I wasn't going to let that happen to you. You saved MJ, Peter insisted. You got a second chance. I'll always be in your debt for that. I wish there could have been a second chance for Gwen, Peter 3 mumbled hazily. But I can't take it back. It can't be changed. And that hurts. And there's nothing left to do than to grieve. It's been years, and I don't think I'll ever stop grieving. She was my path, and it ended with her. It ended. Peter 3's voice finally broke on that last sentence. Emotional exhaustion swept the pair of them, and, as if by only mental instinct, they leaned into each other, one arm sweeping over the backs of each other, heads pressing gently as they both shared the desire to take each other's pain away. Peter could hear his brother inhale a breath between his gritted teeth, and his heart felt the piercing shards of grief and empathy. They sat in silence, only sharing in each other's grief, for they were the only ones in the universe who could understand. I think, Peter began in a hushed voice, then paused as if to collect the right words. I think, even despite everything, I'd rather feel all of this than feel nothing at all. It hurts. It tears me apart, each time, all the time. But that's almost good, right? Because it means it meant something to us. It means it's real. More real than some stupid sticky notes on a wall. Peter 3 choked. Swinging an arm around his little brother's shoulder, he pulled Peter in and planted a firm, strong kiss on the top of his brown curls. Peter leaned in, feeling the firm texture of his brother's suit against his cheek and jaw, and let out a deep sigh. Rattling caught their ears, and they broke apart in an instant. Sitting up straight, Peter leapt into a squatting position on top of the rafters and hid behind one of the wooden pillars stretching to the ceiling. Beside him, Peter 3 mimicked his movement. Someone appeared from behind the doors leading into the interior, peeking her head around curiously. It was a relatively young woman, maybe around Peter 2's age, with a tangle of messy brown hair that almost resembled a bee's nest. There was an Alice band that kept it out of her eyes, but the tangle of knots seemed to inflate for a foot past her head and fell past her shoulders. She had a pair of octagonal-shaped glasses on. Stark white, and was pushing herself forward in a refined steel wheelchair, clearly made with money, as the back cushions were made from a comfortable leather and the leg rest allowed her legs to stretch out forward. The woman pushed herself forward, craning her neck as if to peek inside. "Hello? Is anyone there?" "Stay here," Peter 3 whispered. Oh, wait, he's not crying anymore. Hold on. There. "Stay here," Peter 3 whispered, and Peter glanced around to see his elder brother had pulled his mask back on. Without getting a chance to slide in a word of protest, Peter 3 fell backward from the rafter, flipping over midair and landed neatly on the ground in front of the woman. The lady yelped in surprise, her jaw falling open and jerking backward instinctively. "Hello!" Peter 3 greeted cheerfully, raising a hand in greeting. "Hi! Sorry, didn't mean to scare you. How's it going? Nice weather, huh?" The woman seemed extremely interested, almost unnervingly so. As soon as Spider-Man dropped down, she pushed herself forward, tilting her head almost akin to a very curious owl. "You can just let me know if you want to take a picture or sign something, you know," Peter 3 quipped, although there was a slight edge of caution in his tone. Peter leaned in from up above, craning his neck to catch the woman's face while still trying to conceal himself. "Everything all right?" Peter 3 continued nervously, stepping back a little. "Yeah," the woman whispered, apparently starting to come back to herself. She stared at Spider-Man intently for a moment, then sat up properly in her wheelchair. Yeah, I'm okay. Do you mind me asking, Spider-Man, Are you from this universe? Or from the other one? Oh, snap! Who could it be? Who could it be? Preview for next time. Oh ho ho! Who could it be? Stay tuned and find out.